Hey, it's Alex from Motoroso.com, your dedicated auto parts marketplace. A couple weeks back, we did a product spotlight for the Precision Turbo Kit 11910, which is for a 2.3-liter Ecoboost Mustang. And today we're in studio with our friend Brandon's Ecoboost, and we're gonna be doing an installation how-to guide. You can shop for the 11910 kit at Motoroso.com, where all the products are sold by trusted vendors at great prices, and the shipping is always free with no minimum. Let's get rolling. All right, I have to admit that the first time I heard Ford was gonna put a 4-cylinder turbo into a Mustang, I thought it was sacrilege. Nothing replaces the sound of a V8, and I had to ask, what is this world coming to? But as is usual with the inevitable march of technology and Ford's engineering prowess, the Ecoboost has proven to be a fantastic platform. And some people are out there doing really extensive mods and getting 600-700 horsepower. But with even bolt-on mods, this platform can be pushed to over 500 horsepower. And one of the best ways to get there is through the Precision Turbo Kit we're gonna be installing in just a moment. Now, Brandon's got a bunch of other mods, including an intake and an exhaust, and we'll cover all of his mods in the build walk around that we do, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes here. He had a dyno run before he came in, and he's putting 267 horsepower at the wheels and 358 foot-pounds of torque. So he hasn't seen a massive power gain, but he saw a pretty decent bump in the torque. Once this kit is in, we think even with a modest tune, easily gonna be in the 400s. All right, before we get started, let's just do a quick overview of all the steps we're gonna take. Now, this is a pretty easy install. We don't have to pull the motor or anything. We can easily access the turbo because it's supposed to be a V8 and all that space in there, but it's not, it's a Turbo 4. So we can actually get to what we need to access. The first thing we're gonna do is disconnect the battery. Then we're gonna disconnect the piping for the intercooler and the exhaust. Then we're gonna pull out the oil and the coolant lines, a little bit of drainage, unbolt the turbo, bolt the new one in, hook everything back up, then get it over to the dyno to do a tune, and we're ready to go. You're gonna need a decent set of tools for this job. Grab yourself a 1/2" and 3/8" ratchet, grab all your metric sockets. We recommend 3 and 6" ratchet extensions. You're gonna need a reverse Torx 8mm socket, which isn't in every tool set. You're gonna need multiple 10mm wrenches, multiple needle nose pliers, and a crescent wrench, as well as flathead screwdrivers for prying and sliding some of those hoses off. We used a mirror at one point to look underneath the turbo, and you're gonna need a torque wrench to put it all back together. First, let's grab one of your 10mm sockets and pull off the negative battery terminal. Next, we're gonna remove the PCV quick disconnect. Push down on the PCV, use your flathead screwdriver to slide over the lock, and it'll slide right off. Here we're removing the blow-off valve recirculation hose. Now we used a set of channel locks to compress the spring hose clamps, slid those up on the hose, and we're able to pull it straight off. If you have a little bit of trouble, just use your flathead screwdriver to help coax it off. Now we're gonna get the air intake tube out of the way. Now Brandon has an aftermarket air intake, so yours might not look exactly the same, but it's gonna be really similar. In this case, first we loosen the hose clamp on the coupler and pop the air intake tube out of the coupler, leaving the coupler on the turbo. Next, you're gonna disconnect the map sensor by depressing the tab on the clip and pulling it off, and then disconnect the hose from the air intake box by loosening the hose clamp, and then the whole tube will pop right out. Next, you're gonna disconnect your intercooler piping. Brandon's got an aftermarket intercooler and he's got this chrome pipe, so it looks a little different from factory, but you're gonna follow the same steps. We started on the turbo side first by loosening the hose clamp and then fidgeting with the flathead screwdriver to get the hose out of that silicone tubing and popping it out, leaving the coupler on the turbo. Then you're gonna go down to the intercooler and do exactly the same. Before you can fully remove the intercooler pipe, you're going to need to slide the vacuum hose off the blow-off valve, and there's no clamp holding it on, so it just slides right off. In the next few steps, we're going to be removing the 3 wastegate actuator lines. These are hard plastic lines that connect into rubber hoses that then connect onto the turbo. And it's just air in there, so there's no mess to worry about. The first actuator line you're going to remove is on the face of the wastegate. The second line is on the inlet housing of the turbo. And the third line is really hard to get a shot to show you, but it's a 5-inch long, about 3/4 inch plastic tube that goes into another rubber hose that connects to the turbo. In this case, it's actually easier to disconnect the line from the rubber hose, and then you can remove the rubber hose later when the turbo's fully off. Now you're going to remove the intercooler coupler from the turbo itself so we have full access to the oil feed line. To remove the oil feed line, it's a single 8mm bolt that goes through a tab. And once that bolt is out, this is an O-ring style fitting, and a gentle tug will pop it right out. Then the flexible hose can be moved out of the way just like we do here. Now this is the oil feed line, so that means there's oil in the line and there's gonna be a little bit of drippage, so have a rag on hand to soak up what comes out. Our next step is to remove the 2 coolant lines, and this one makes a mess. You're gonna lose about half of your coolant, so make sure to place a large drain pan directly under the engine in line with the turbo. And of course, if you don't want to deal with that mess, feel free to drain your coolant before you even start this job. Now the coolant lines are secured by one 8mm bolt. And again, these are an O-ring style fitting. So once that bolt is out, a gentle tug will pull the hoses out and the flexible lines can be carefully moved out of the way. And now the last line to be disconnected from the turbo is the oil drain line. And this is the toughest part of the removal process because you can't see the oil drain line connecting to the bottom of the turbo. And you're gonna have to do a lot of this by feel. Now Ford thought they'd be funny and they made this bolt a 10mm instead of the 8mm like the other 2 we just removed. So grab a 10mm socket and the smallest ratchet that you have. Loosen the 10mm bolt, being careful not to drop it down into the engine bay. And once that's out, again, this is an O-ring style connector that can be gently pressed away from the turbo. It's time to head over to the downpipe. Now Brandon has an aftermarket downpipe on his car, so this step will be a little bit different from stock, but we'll talk you through it. First, unplug the O2 sensor from the wiring harness above the downpipe. Then loosen the 2 15mm bolts that connect the downpipe to the turbo, but don't fully remove the bolts or separate the downpipe from the turbo yet. Now, go underneath the car and remove the 2 13mm nuts from the catalytic converter support, and lift the studs out of the bracket to allow this to move more freely. Head back up to the top, fully remove the 2 15mm bolts, and separate the downpipe from the turbo. The next step is to remove the heat shield that covers the turbo. First, remove the top 2 13mm bolts from the top of the heat shield. Then, remove the harmonic balancer on the engine mount with a 10mm socket and pull it out so you can access the lowest bolt of the heat shield. The final heat shield bolt is an 8mm, and with that removed, you can pull the heat shield away. With the heat shield out, it's now time for the moment of truth and we can pull that silly little factory turbo off our Ecoboost. In Ford's interesting Ecoboost engine design, the turbo mounts directly to the head. So those first 2 13mm bolts you pulled out from the heat shield were actually the first 2 bolts that hold the turbo on the head. Now you can remove the bottom 2 13mm bolts, loosening them evenly while supporting the turbo so it doesn't drop. With the last bolt removed, you can pull the turbo out completely. Congratulations on making it this far. All the stock stuff is out, and we're ready to start putting the new Precision Turbo in. Your new Precision Turbo kit comes with new downpipe studs. We didn't have an 11/32 wrench, so we used a crescent wrench to thread and tighten the new studs onto the turbo. Next, you're going to reuse the studs that held the turbo to the head. Drop a little thread locker on the threads and use an 8mm reverse torque socket to tighten until snug. Now, place the new gasket from your Precision Turbo kit over the studs. And you can carefully slide the new turbo mounting points over the studs, and the turbo can hang there while you grab your nuts. Thread the nuts onto the studs evenly using a 13mm socket. Lightly tightening them all in a crisscross pattern to seat the turbo flush against the gasket. But do not tighten the top two nuts very much, because the nuts need to come back off for the heat shield, and you don't want to accidentally pull the studs out with them, otherwise you're going to have to repeat this whole process. Now grab your torque wrench and tighten only the bottom two nuts to 37 foot-pounds of torque. Now you can remove the top two 13mm nuts as we described a moment ago. Replace the heat shield over the turbo, thread the nuts back on, and tighten with a torque wrench to 37 foot-pounds of torque. Reinstall the 8mm bottom bolt for the heat shield and tighten it to snug, but don't over-tighten it. Now reinstall the harmonic balancer on the motor mount and use a 10mm socket to torque to 21 foot-pounds. We're ready to reconnect the downpipe to the turbo now. For this, let's start under the vehicle and realign the studs in the catalytic converter bracket and thread the nuts on without tightening them yet. Back up top, realign the downpipe against the turbo over the studs, making sure the exhaust gasket is facing the correct direction and lined up properly. While you're up here, plug in your O2 sensor into the harness. Head back under the car and tighten the catalytic converter bracket nuts to 18 foot-pounds. You've officially arrived at the hardest part of this job: reconnecting the oil drain line to the bottom of the turbo where you can't see it. This took us a long time, so we really hope it takes you less time with a few tips from us. As we mentioned earlier in the video, the first step to making this easier was to not move the line very much in the first place. If you followed that, then hopefully you can press the O-ring fitting back up into its hole and you'll feel it seat in nicely with a subtle click. To protect the integrity of the O-ring and help this process, smear a little bit of motor oil on that O-ring. Now the challenge here is the bolt hole on the tab lining up straight enough to cleanly thread the 10mm bolt back into the threads. Don't try to force this bolt back in, because if you strip these threads, you just seriously your day. Grab a mirror and look to see how straight the hole in the tab lines up with the threaded hole on the turbo body. You want it dead on. If it's not lined up, gently press on the line in the right direction, ideally using your hands, but you can use a screwdriver carefully if necessary. Be patient with this, because it's going to take you a few attempts. Thread your 10mm bolt back up into the hole and tighten with a 10mm socket and a small ratchet. Now with that pain in the neck behind you, you're on the home stretch. It's time to connect the oil feed line. Smear a little oil on the O-ring to protect it, and reconnect the oil feed line by pressing the O-ring fitting into the hole until you get a subtle click, then replace the 8mm bolt and tighten it until snug, but don't over tighten it. The next step is to reconnect the two coolant lines, making sure to put them back in the way you took them off. Now there's a very specific order to reinstall these lines. The top line's mounting tab needs to go over the bottom line's mounting tab. Make sure these two lines are arranged this way, and make sure when you're pressing them back in, you get a subtle click from each of them. If these tabs are misaligned, neither will be seated properly and it will leak coolant, so make sure you do this carefully. Once aligned, place the 8mm bolt and tighten until snug. In the next step, you'll install a new coupler to the turbo inlet for the air intake. Your Precision Turbo Kit comes with a silicone hose adapter with a reducer that's compatible with the OEM air intake tube. In this case, Brandon's aftermarket intake was a 3-inch tube, exactly the same as the inlet diameter on the turbo. So we used an aftermarket 3-inch to 3-inch coupler in this video, and you'll need to go get a custom coupler depending on the size of your aftermarket intake if you have one. Next step is to reinstall the 3 wastegate actuator lines. Start with the one on the bottom of the turbo because it's harder to get to. First, you'll need to grab the old vacuum line we left on the OEM turbo and bring that over to the new turbo, securing it with the spring hose clamp. Then press the hard plastic line into the rubber hose and set the spring clamp on that end of the hose. Next, refasten the rubber line to the front of the wastegate, also securing with the spring clamp. Then, reconnect the rubber line on the turbo inlet housing, securing with the spring clamp. It's time to reconnect the intercooler piping. First, you'll install the coupler onto the new turbo and tighten the hose clamp on the turbo side. Now slide the intercooler pipe down into the coupler on the intercooler side. Now slide the top of the intercooler pipe into the coupler and tighten the hose clamp. Don't forget to tighten the hose clamp on the intercooler end. Reattach the blow-off valve hose by pressing it back onto the blow-off valve. Now we're ready to reconnect our air intake tube. Start by sliding it onto the turbo side. Then position it into the airbox side. When everything is lined up properly, tighten the hose clamps on both sides. Reconnect the map sensor by pressing it back onto the clip. Press your PCV valve back onto the hose until the lock firmly clicks in place. Now you're going to need to replace at least a gallon of coolant, making sure to use the correct coolant, which in our case was 50/50 orange Dexcool. And lastly, reconnect your battery, and you just finished a turbo swap on your Ecoboost Mustang. Now our plan was to get the Mustang over to the tuner for a custom tune and a dyno run to show you some numbers, but unfortunately that wasn't able to happen before the video had to come out. So make sure you check out the build walk around with Brandon's Mustang. We'll definitely have some numbers to share at that time. That wraps up the installation of our precision turbo upgrade kit on our friend Brandon's 2.3 liter Ecoboost Mustang. The part number is 11910, and you can shop for that and hundreds of thousands of other top name brand products sold by trusted vendors at great prices where the shipping is always free at Motoroso.com. If you thought the video was helpful, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for all of our future product spotlights, reviews, installations, and builds. And thanks for watching.